Alright, so this one's going to be a little out of the ordinary because you're going to have to watch this one twice. Right now we're going to shove it into chapter 11 because you need to know how to do this before you can move on to 11.5. And then you're going to have to watch it again while we're doing chapter 9. Alright, so the first thing we need to talk about is the zero product property, and what it says, and I've talked about it in class before, is that when you're multiplying two things together, the only way to get zero is if one or both of those things is zero. So we're going to use the zero product property to solve these quadratics. And you just got to think, if I'm multiplying this and this together and I get zero, that means either this set of parentheses has to be zero or this one. So what you can do is take the first set of parentheses, 4t plus 1, and set it equal to 0. So you're going to solve that for 0 to see what would make it 0. So you're just going to solve that little equation. Subtract 1, and you get 4t equals negative 1. Divide both sides by 4. So now you know that t equals negative 1/4. Okay, and then you take the other factor, t minus 2, and then you can solve for t, so add 2, and you get t equals 2. So you've got two solutions. T is either going to be negative 1/4 or 2. Alright, so we'll try two more. Take the first factor, set it equal to 0. Take the second factor and set it equal to 0, because if I'm going to multiply these two things, that means either one or both of them have to equal 0 for me to multiply them and get 0. So you're going to set each factor equal to 0. And solve, and you get x equals negative 1 and x equals 5. And you can list it the way I did, or up here, or you can list it like this, negative 1 or 5. Alright, I'm going to give you a second. I want you to pause the video and try B, and then I'll show you the answer. Okay, so the answer is negative 3/2 or 4. Here's a multiple choice question, good ACT practice. You've got a quadratic equation and you need to figure out what the solutions are. So when you're trying to solve a quadratic equation, meaning my biggest exponent's the 2, you're going to first try to factor. So take that quadratic, x squared plus 8x plus 15 equals 0, and factor the left-hand side. Okay, so what multiplies to give you 15 but adds to give you 8? How about 5 and 3? And now that we're to this point, now we know that either this or this has to equal 0 for me to multiply them and get 0. So I'm going to solve x plus 5 equals 0 and x plus 3 equals 0. So I know that x either has to be negative 5 or it has to be negative 3. Negative 5, negative 3 is A. If you haven't noticed by now, all you really have to do to solve these is to take the opposite, as long as there's not a coefficient in front of the x. It's just the opposite of whatever this is. So it was negative 5, and then it was negative 3. Alright, so I'll do a couple more. For A, of course, you're going to factor. And then your signs are minus, minus. So ask yourself what multiplies to give you negative 14, but subtracts to give you negative 5. Because you know they're going to have to be different signs. So that's going to be 7 and 2, and it's going to be negative 7 because the bigger number is supposed to be what the middle number is. So they're both negative. Alright, so m is going to have to be negative 2 to make that 0. And m is going to have to be 7 to make that 0. So that's my answer. Alright, and then B, you're going to factor. What's going to multiply to give you negative 20, but subtract to give you 1. your signs are going to have to be opposite. And I'll give you a second to think. What multiplies to give you 20 but subtracts to give you 1? It's 5 and 4. So that tells me that P must equal -5 for the first set of parentheses and +4 for the second set. Now if you'll pause it and try C on your own, you're going to have to, actually I'll do C with you because you have to do the MAC method. So you're going to slide and multiply and you get a squared minus 15a plus 36. Now what multiplies to give you 36 but adds to give you 15? It's going to be -12 and -3. And now you have to divide both sides by 2, or not both sides, but both factors. And you get a minus 6, and then 2a minus 3. So now to find your zeros is what we call them. This one's going to be easy because you know it's going to have to be 6, because 6 minus 6 is 0. So you know a is going to be 6. And now this one's not so easy. There is a trick to it though. Take the opposite of this, so +3, and put it over the coefficient. So +3 over 2. That works every time. If you need to solve it though, if you can't remember that, you can just solve it. So if you set it equal to 0 and solve the little equation, you get 2a equals 3, so divide by 2, and you get a equals 3/2, like I had here. So you can do the little trick where you take the opposite of this number, so it's -3, I'm going to take a +3 and divide it by the coefficient, so +3 divided by 2. Alright, so now we have to solve this one, and it's getting a little harder because it's not set equal to 0. And it doesn't automatically look like you can factor it. But what you're going to do is, when you have to solve a quadratic, you always want to set it equal to 0. So what that means is you are going to take everything and put it on one side of the equation. So you get x squared plus 14x plus 49. And this side I have 0. And now it's pretty obvious that you can factor. What gives you 49 when you multiply, but adds to give you 14? And it's going to be 7 and 7, which means that x would have to be -7, because -7 plus 7 is 0. -7 plus 7 is 0, so anything times 0 would give me the 0. So the only way for this equation to work is if x were -7. Alright, and we're going to do another one, and this is not equal to 0, but for me to use the zero product property, it has to be equal to 0. So that's what I'm going to do, is solve it for 0, and I get 4x squared minus 21x minus 18 equals 0. Now we want to factor. It's not going to be so easy though, because we're going to have to do the MAC factoring. So we are going to multiply 4 and 18. And we get x squared minus 21x minus 72 equals 0. So what multiplies to give you 72 but subtracts to give you 21? So I'll give you just a second to think about it. Multiplies to give you 72 but subtracts to give you 21. If you want to think about it on your own, pause it, and when you think about it, play it again. It's going to be 24 and 3. So it's going to be -24, because the middle number is negative, and +3. Now you divide by 4. Reduce if possible. On the first factor you can't reduce, so you bottoms up. Second factor you can reduce. 24 divided by 4 is 6. So we set it equal to 0 because we're trying to solve an equation. And the only way for two things to multiply and give me 0 is if one of them or both of them are 0. So you're going to figure out what would make, what would make this set of parentheses 0? And that's opposite of this over this. So negative 3 over 4. Now, if you don't believe me and you want me to prove it, I will. If I set this equal to 0 and solve, I get negative 3. 4x equals negative 3. And if I divide both sides by 4, I get negative 3 over 4. And then over here, the only way to make that 0 is if I had a positive 6. So positive 6 or negative 3/4. All right, I'm going to let you try these three. I will give you the answers. So if you'll pause it and try these three, and then I'll give you the answers. Okay, so there's your answers. Hopefully you got them all right. If you need to ask me anything, you can contact me in any of these ways. Otherwise, I will see you tomorrow.